She regarded her sister from across the arena floor, as she felt the key of a Sect initiate settle beside her. Glancing over at her champion, the Inquisitor saw the young woman's eyes flashing with irritation, her hands resting contemptuously on her weapons, two short swords that hung at her waist. It was clear that she saw her presence on this stage as an insult, for in many ways it was. After all, what face might be gained by the slaying of a mortal? Worse still, the defeat of this particular mortal was not without risk, for though Huang was now little more than an eyesore in the eyes of the Imperial clan, she was still part of that lineage. And none within the Empire could be allowed to spill Imperial blood without censure. The girl no doubt feared she'd be spending the rest of her days constantly looking over her shoulder for Imperial assassins. A not unfounded fear, though hardly specific just to her. She had little intention of letting anyone beyond her Inquisitors, who had seen her half-sister's shame, live long enough to spread news of it. Whether they were her killer or simply a spectator to it, it mattered not.
"Your name?"
she asked.
"Zihen, Great One."
The woman bowed deeply.
"This lowly one is honored to have been chosen for this task, though she regrets its necessity. She will take no pride in her actions to come. She well understands how easy it can be to be led astray."
Of course she would. All of the cultivators she had brought with her had been traitors once. She hummed quietly, affecting a calm smile.
"As do I, which is why you have been given this chance at recompense. However, you are not the woman who will soon stand across you as your own opponent. Your crimes are far different in scope. To that end, do not overly concern yourself with your foe's former standing. Whatever she once was, she is a traitor now. Merely a nameless foe of the Empire."
Zen bowed deeper, relief flooding from her.
"This one understands."
The Dragonkin nodded.
"Good. I have briefed you on the weapons our enemy has at their disposal, yet know that they may have more. To that end, close the distance quickly. Strike decisively and without fanfare. Doing so will nullify what few advantages she possesses."
Protest flashed in the young woman's eyes at the idea that a mortal would have any advantages over her at all.
Yes, Great One. This lowly one recalls your lessons on those firework launchers, and is confident of her ability to counter them. She shall make a mockery of her foe's tools, before finally giving her the killing blow. Don't. She's tongue clicked as she sought to reinforce her point. "Twice I have clashed with our foe and his machinations. Each time I have triumphed, but not before losing 10 of my most prized Inquisitors. Peak experts brought low not by his hands, but by tools crafted by them in the hands of his lessers." Truth be told, she still didn't know how the first aid was slain. It could well have been the man himself who performed the deed, though she doubted it. As powerful as divinities were, not even Mern herself would have been able to kill 8 peak experts simultaneously. Not when they were spread miles apart in different fortress towns. If they were close together, it would be a different story. But the distances involved made she suspect that Johansson had made use of some sort of mystic tool or spirit beast. If it was some manner of tool she had not seen before. Which was not too surprising. She was sure her foe still had many such weapons held in reserve. "Like the flying spirit beasts that circle overhead," she thought. 12 times have we struck one of his ilk down, yet they are constantly replaced." Then there was the armed monstrosity that Shui rode to their last meeting upon, a brother to the art piece she had mocked on her first visit to the nearby town. A nearby town that had great mirrors that lit up the night sky so that repeating firework launchers could unleash their deadly payload upon any airborne attacker. With that in mind, she would be surprised if Huan didn't have access to some kind of more powerful cultivator-killing mystic tool. It would lend some more weight to the man's confidence that he would win this duel, despite his champion being little more than a mortal woman. "Kill her. Do it quickly and efficiently. Move erratically on your approach. Use your blades as a shield. Once you are in range, skewer her. Do these things and you shall be rewarded.
The Dragon King could see it, the urge for the woman across from her to scoff. Fortunately for her, and she, for she had little desire to call up a second initiate and repeat her instructions while standing over the cooling corpse of the first, she withheld that desire.
And be ready for some manner of trick. Our foe is many things, but he is no fool. If he bet my sister against me, it was because he expected her to be able to triumph. Keep that in mind.
The other woman's expression hardened slightly at that, as she recalled that while her foe was immortal, she had the backing of a divinity. When she finally nodded, it was with a seriousness that she had not possessed before. She smiled, satisfied that she had been heard. Turning on the spot, the Inquisitor climbed the stairs of her side of the arena to once more take her seat upon her throne. And say what one would about the soft gold acting as a subtle insult, it did provide an excellent view of the arena below. The aesthetic of the criss-crossing marble and jade checkerboard made for an excellent contrast. Once this Johansson was securely within the Imperial fold, she would make sure to request a variant of this arena be created within the confines of the Inquisitorium. Something the prideful being would undoubtedly balk at, and thus would serve as an excellent lesson in the need for obedience on his part, once the 12-fold seal was applied. Down below, she watched as her champion spoke to her opponent for the first time, using ki to project her voice across the arena, given the distances involved. A trick on her foe's part, she now realized. She had thought at the time that the massive size of the arena was merely an expression of power on the divinity's part. And it was. But now she realized that the increased distance between the two sides also gave his champion more time to fire upon her own before they clashed. She squashed the irritation that threatened to build within her at being outfoxed in such a manner.
My name is Zenhi, Initiate of the Shrouded Tail Sect, Servant of the Celestial Throne.
The cultivator pointedly did not bow. The dragonkin opposite her did, though, if perfunctorily, her hands resting on two objects on her belt.
Juan, mortal member of the Tenhuo Engineering Society, servant of no one.
Mutters rippled through the Imperial section of the stands, as Xi's people sought to make sense of the former magistrate's words. She, for her part, was also interested, if only because this engineering society seemed to suggest that this Jack Johansson was a proponent of natural philosophy. That outdated method of cultivation has certainly not had a presence in the north prior to Jack Johansson's arrival. The reports she had read on the trip up here would have mentioned it if they were. Instead, according to the latest census on the area, the local sects were a much more normal mixture of kinest and systemism. And while kinism has certainly been born of the observations of natural philosophy, it had also quite systematically replaced it over the last 1,000 years.
Then again, what is 1,000 years to an immortal? She thought.
Still, that would certainly go some way to explaining Johansson's focus on tool use over more conventional techniques. Though it begs the question, will his power in battle be weaker as a result? That had ultimately been the downfall of natural philosophy. His focus on the gradual increase in collectivist knowledge was inefficient when compared to the strides that might be made through personal introspection provided by kinism and systemism. Few to none of the great legends of yesteryear were natural philosophers, and thus it was commonly accepted that the methodology had died out.
Perhaps not all the practitioners, though, she mused. And given the heights he has risen to, it may be worth broaching the issue of revisiting it.
Though that would have to wait, as an unnaturally flat feminine voice seemed to issue from all about the arena. Combat shall begin in 3. Participants, make ready. Zen's blades left their sheaths, as the strange voice counted down, twirling them casually as she settled into a squat. Across from her, Huang's hands hung loosely at her sides, eyes sharp as she regarded her opponent.
1.
As soon as the last syllable was uttered, Zen shot forward, robes rippling behind her, as she flitted from side to side erratically on her approach. Yet Huang did not move. Her posture was tense but steady, eyes tracking her incoming opponent as they shot toward her. Picking up her speed, Zen's graceful movements nonetheless caused cracks to form beneath her with every step, the mundane stone incapable of enduring a cultivator moving at full pelt. In little more than 2 seconds she would be in range to strike. Yet Huan remained still. And for just a moment, she had hope. Hope that her sister was not entirely gone, that she had simply bided her time. That she now intended to show her true colours, by sacrificing her life to ensure the Empire gained victory. Xi's heart soared as Zen closed the remaining distance with a final leap, her weapons outstretched like the horns of an oncoming bull. Xi smiled, imagining serenity in her half-sibling's heart in this moment of selflessness. And it was in that moment of triumph that Huan moved. Her hands darted not towards her weapons, but another object at the small of her back, and suddenly all she felt was pain. A screeching sound, of a like she'd never heard before, lanced into her brain like a bolt of lightning, forcing her to wince and reflexively lurch in on herself. Nor was she alone in doing so, as the rest of the Imperial side of the arena flinched in pain at the sudden ear-splitting noise. As 2 cracks rang out, barely audible over the ear-wrenching noise, she had to wonder if this was an attack. Did this divinity mean to attack them now, using the duel as a distraction? Yet as she levered her head up, she saw through squinted eyes that the other side of the arena had not moved. Johansson sat just as he always had, and while the visages of the men and women around him appeared curious, they had not shifted from their seats either. No, this was no attack. At least not one that had been aimed at the duel's observers, they merely being collateral for the technique. Indeed, as she and the rest of the Imperial side steeled themselves, drawing on their ki to harden their senses, they turned to regard the arena down below. Only one figure still stood. What she now knew to be 2 small firework launchers at her side, the woman almost looked surprised as she regarded the kneeling figure before her. An expression mirrored by Zen, as her hands slowly moved from her ears to press against her gut, from which a red stain continued to grow, dripping down her robes to form a slowly growing pool of blood around her knees. Silence suffused the area, as Zen's laboured breaths became audible now that the screeching was gone. The crowd was almost holding its breath, as if questioning their own eyes as they stared at the scene before them. Then, Huan seemed to recover, keeping both weapons, which to Xi's understanding should be empty. Aimed at her foe, she casually kicked the woman's discarded blades away from her.
How?
The cultivator asked.
You're a mortal. How did you...
A shot rang out, and Zen slumped lifelessly to the side. Silence reigned through the arena as the final echoes of the shot rang out. None could believe what they had just seen. A mortal against a cultivator should have been a foregone conclusion. Yet the impossible had occurred. And it hadn't been a fight. It had been an execution. Then, as if to break the stillness, Huan stepped around the corpse of her foe to face the Imperial side in full. She bowed, low, deep, and mocking, and Xi's blood boiled with rage. Shui couldn't hold back her amusement as she watched Huang all but swagger back to their side of the arena. An amusing thought to be sure, that she was so happy to see her once rival victorious. But then again, the past year had been nothing if not surprising. So much so that the thought of a mortal defeating a cultivator, admittedly a mere initiate, did not seem as shocking as it once might. What the hell was that technique? She leaned over to whisper to Johansson. He turned to her, saying something, but the pigkin heard none of it. Realization coming upon her, the woman reached up to pluck out the small plugs she had been provided before the bout, and instructed to insert into her ears. A consideration she had noted that she alone had been afforded. None of the mortals had been provided the same objects, nor had they flinched like the Imperials had, when that low ringing had pierced through the protections those plugs had provided. Which meant that whatever technique Juan had employed, it only affected cultivators. Or it should, she thought, gaze fitting to where Lady Anne sat on the far side of her lord. The Tigerkin had not made use of any plugs, yet had not flinched unduly when Huang's technique was employed either. An omnidirectional sonic emitter, Jack responded, a certain amount of gloating satisfaction pervading his tone. Basically a big dog whistle, boosted by the architecture of this arena, echoes and all that. A what? Shui frowned. His featureless helm regarded her. A little something to turn a cultivator's advantages against them. Shui frowned at that non-answer, even as she rolled the small plugs over in her hands. It was clear the man was playing coy, high on his victory. That was fine, if irritating. A man was allowed his secrets, and though she knew she had risen in her lord's estimation after her debacles in challenging him for leadership, she knew she still wasn't part of his inner circle. Either way, she'd gotten some small understanding of what he was saying. While much of it had been gibberish, the words whistle and echo weren't. That, combined with the plug she'd been wearing, told her that whatever tool Juan had used, it had made use of sound as a weapon. Which was an interesting idea. One that was not entirely unheard of. The screamers of the Southern Islands were well known for their intimidating war cries. That was all they were, though. Intimidating. An attempt to cow the enemy before the initial clash by surprising them. This hadn't been like that. Shui had seen what happened to Zen just before the initial clash. The woman had all but collapsed, even before Huang casually put 2 bolts into her guts. The idea was rather horrifying, now that she thought of it. With that said, she could imagine several counters now that she'd seen it in action. And that was with preparation. If she was in the middle of a fight, she could think of at least one that would work. Sure, it would be painful, and she'd need a healer right after, but it would work, and allow her to continue fighting. And if she could think of a solution like that, Shui had no doubt the High Inquisitor could too. As the pigkin watched Juan all but dance up the stairs to Johansson's seat, she knew that whatever weapon she had would only work once. The enemy would be prepared for it next time. Still, as Johansson stood up to pat Juan bodily on the back, turning the conquering warrior into something akin to a blushing initiate, Shui knew that was a problem for tomorrow. For today, they'd won. Though as she gazed across at the furious expression of the High Inquisitor, she could only conclude that tomorrow's victory would not be nearly so easy. Not by a long shot, she murmured, as 2 initiates from the Imperial side clambered down to reluctantly collect the body, as if afraid they might lose face merely by being in physical contact with a woman who had been defeated by a mortal. Fortunately, for whoever was slated to fight next, Johansson had no intention of placing another mortal on the field. The Imperials wouldn't go for another lowball attempt. Which was why Johansson intended to deploy his best next. And though it stung, more than the wounds beneath her bandages, Shui knew that wasn't her. Not after her injuries. And maybe not even then. Not because she lacked sheer power and cultivation, but because she lacked mastery of Johansson's tools. Only one woman could claim that right. The Pigkin's gaze flitted over to where Lady Anne was standing, her gaze not on where her lord was congratulating a bashful Juan, but on the arena. An almost hungry expression pervading her features as she regarded the bloody arena floor. A veritable unknown, who had carved her way through the fleeing instinctive horde that had besieged Tenhuo, but whose actual skill was almost entirely unknown within the city itself. For though her ki was barely of the low, profound level, Shui knew that meant little where Jack Johansson's tools were concerned. And none within the province had more familiarity with those weapons than Lady Anne herself. With that said, the former general couldn't help but wonder if those tools would allow the Tigerkin to triumph against a foe who would undoubtedly be many times her superior in cultivation. Shui didn't know, so she could only hope that Jack Johansson did.